It's a hill in a tube. Okay, maybe we're not quite there yet. Welcome to another episode of The GameSmith. In today's episode, we're going to be making grassy and rocky hills. Now, there are plenty of examples of other tabletop crafters on YouTube who have made great examples of this tabletop terrain. Now, this happens to be our example of these classic rocky and grassy hills. We're going to start with the base, and I'm choosing to use these artist cotton canvas boards. I found them at the dollar store for $1.25. And I'm using the 8x35cm and the 20x20cm sizes. You should use whatever basing material you'd prefer, such as cardboard or chipboard. I would have preferred to use some MDF boards so I could cut them to odd shapes, but I didn't have any at the time I filmed this. Next, we're going to use some XPS or extruded polystyrene insulation foam as the actual hills. This is a great material that most tabletop crafters are familiar with. If you don't have any XPS foam available, I recommend stacking several layers of foam board together and build them up to the height you want. We need to measure these larger pieces so they'll fit onto the canvas boards. The easiest way to match the foam and the canvas boards are just to use the board as a size template. Next, we'll use an extending utility knife to cut our foam. If the knife is sharp and the blade is long enough to hold at an angle, you can cut the XPS foam to have a smooth edge rather than a jagged or a rough edge. Now, when it comes to shaping the XPS foam, we can make use of the extending utility knife that we just used to cut our blocks. The challenge is that the blades on this tool aren't really long enough to cut the XPS foam at the sharp hilly angles we want to create. As a result, we'll likely have to make many angled cuts to create a slope that we want our hills to have. Another tool we can use is a household chef's knife. If it's sharp enough, these long blades are perfect for shaping XPS foam into long slopes. Check out just about any of the Bard's Crafts terrain videos and you'll see just how proficient someone can be with this tool. The tool that I'm going to use is Foam Factory's Hotwire Freehand Router. This tool comes in a kit and is excellent for working with polystyrene and styrofoam. I used this tool to create our aquatic rocky terrain and fully explained how to use this product in that video. I'll put a link in the corner for you. The wire filament on the router is shapeable, so we can mold it into the configuration we want to cut our foam into. When the wire heats up, it will cut through the foam quite easily and in the shape of the wire. I think for this build we'll want to use a straight cutting edge. We want to cut our XPS foam in shallow angles by slowly dragging the hot wire cutter across the edges. If you're using some kind of hot wire cutter as I am, I suggest you work in a well-ventilated area. Also, you should have a small fan in your workspace to blow any vapors away from you. Using the cutting tool to create numerous small cuts will allow you to shape the hill into the shape you want. Since I'm making 4 small hills, I don't want them to look identical to each other. We are also cutting a single, much larger hill. This larger hill will have sharp angled hillsides on the short sides and a long gradual slope on the longest edge. Regardless of how you shape or cut your hills, you want to make sure that the angles are about 30 degrees or less, so your miniatures won't slide or tip over. Next, we're going to use some sanding tools that I picked up at the dollar store. I like this sanding sponge, which has different types of coarseness on its different edges. But I also like this pack of 36 pieces of sandpaper that have several levels of grit on them. You can wrap these small pieces of paper around the sponge to get a better grip on them. If you have an electric sanding tool of some kind, you should make sure that you don't dramatically alter the shape of your hill. Regardless of how you sand your XPS hill, you're going to want to wear a mask to protect your mouth and nose. I suggest you wear some safety goggles too. Using this 80 grit paper, we slowly shape our XPS foam hill. I suggest that you use the sandpaper only to make minor changes to the shape of your hill. If you discover you want to make large changes to the shape of your hill, go back to your cutting tools and remove those large areas. The hill doesn't need to be perfectly smooth or have symmetrical sides. In fact, it works to your advantage to have different sized inclines and gradients of slopes in different areas of the hill. You might want the top to be flat or rounded, have sharp angled corners, or small divots to vary the surface of your hill. We want to make sure that the hill fits our base. We want those edges to blend together. When you are happy with the final result, we want to dampen a paper towel and remove all the tiny dust particles from our build. If you have a shop vac or some other specialized cleaning device, I suggest you use that. We need to remove all the dust particles so that the other materials we're going to attach to the XPS foam get the best possible grip. Next, we're going to glue our foam hill to our canvas board base. I'm going to use my trusty hot glue gun to do this, but you can use whatever glue you wish. I do recommend, however, that you avoid using PVA or other water-based glues. The cotton canvas absorbs water and the XPS foam repels water. Not a very good combination when using water-based glues to affix the sides to each other. Now it's time to add our stone features, and we're going to use tree bark for that. I have several large chunks of bark, but I think I'm going to use these packages of smaller pieces of natural bark that I found at the dollar store. We can select different shapes and sizes as rocky features on our hills. We can break the pieces if we need to, and use them on this and many other projects. We have a gentle slope on one side and a deeper slope on the other two sides of this hill. I want to have no rocks on the gentle incline and have quite a few rocks on the other slopes. We can use our hot glue gun to affix our tree bark. Try not to add too much hot glue near the edges of the bark so it doesn't squeeze out when you press it down on the foam. Use a small craft stick rather than your finger to remove the excess glue, because it will be quite hot and you don't want to get a hot glue burn. We'll add a few more bark pieces to this side since the angle of the hill is quite steep. Because of the angle, no miniature will be able to rest on it, so we might as well add a few more rocks to it. Let's divert our attention to our large hill for a moment and see how I'm jigsaw puzzling these bark pieces together. This process is much the same, with the exception that we're adding the bark to the vertical side of our large hill. The rocks on the small hills are much easier to work with, since each is a standalone feature. The cliff face that we are creating needs to have the pieces fit closely together, because I want to avoid large gaps between the bark pieces. Now we turn our attention to our hill in a tube, our fast dry all-purpose caulking. We use this material for filling in the spaces around our rocks and smoothing out the imperfections on our hill. The use of a caulking gun is the best way to deploy this material. We talk about how to use one of these tools in the hedgerows video, so I'll put a link in the corner for you. You can also use modeling paste, texture paste, or flex paste and get the same result as the caulking. We want to minimize the mess, so I'll place a paper layer down on my work surface. We add a small amount of caulking to the XPS hill and using a finger press it into the surface. The caulking has about 20 minutes of working time, so we don't have to rush as we spread it around our tree bark rock formations. We can press the caulking up into the spaces between the bark and the foam, so we can cover those gaps. We can also shape the caulking because of its elastic properties, so we can create small ridges, smooth out divots, and fill in holes. When it comes to the hill itself, we can use a finger to smooth out the features on the XPS foam. This layer doesn't need to be thick at all, just thick enough to cover the foam. As you are spreading the caulking over the foam, one might think to add flock or turf to the top layer. Don't. The problem is that the caulking doesn't bond very well to the tiny particles of the flocking in the turf, and you end up losing most of it. On the plus side, if you have any experience with cake decorating, this step of the build is like putting icing on a cake. Let's skip over to our large hill and add some aggregate to the base of our rocky cliff. We want to mimic the scree or talus deposits at the bottom of a rock face. These are just rocks and debris that fall away from the rock face due to erosion that accumulate at the bottom of the cliff. We can use our hot glue gun to add about a centimeter or half an inch wide shelf of fish tank rocks. I'm using 3 different sizes of aggregate here and just pressing them into the hot glue so that there is a good hold on them. It's best to complete this step in small stages so we don't overcrowd the foot of the cliff. We only want a thin layer of talus to leave room for grass at the bottom. Next, we want to mix some matte Mod Podge and black acrylic paint into a 50-50 mixture. This is a very common mixture we use here at the GameSmith to reinforce our builds. Feel free to change the black to another color if you're wanting your base coat on your large rocks and talus to be a different colored stone. We use the 50/50 paint and Mod Podge mixture on our tree bark formations. We need to make sure to get in all the deep recesses of the bark because these areas will appear as shadows after the rest of the painting is completed. Also, the glue in the Mod Podge will help seal the tree bark and all the small particles in the talus of our build. Next, we have some dollar store craft paints that make up the basic color palette of our rocks. We're going to use dark gray, light gray, and white for the shadow stone colors. You can change the colors to brown, tan, and white for a more earthstone palette. I want to lightly load my brush with dark gray and then use a dabbing technique to add the paint to the rock formations. Don't get too aggressive with the dabbing or you'll get the paint into those wonderful cracks. Likewise, we don't want to completely cover the black painted areas. Next, we lightly load the brush with light gray and dab it onto the bark. Again, we want to avoid filling in the black cracks with the paint, nor do we want to completely cover the dark gray we've just added. We need to make sure that this layer of paint is completely dry before moving on, because we don't want the colors to blend together. For the dry brush layer, we need only a little dab of white paint on our palette. We load very little white paint onto our brush, and then remove most of it onto our palette before we start painting with it. We then drag our brush very lightly over the highest surface features of our rocks. For a detailed tutorial on dry brushing, check out our foundations video on the subject. Next, we're going to add a wash to our stone formations to mute the dry brush and improve the depth of the dark shadows. Citadel makes a great dark wash they call a shade under the name of Nuln Oil. You can, however, mix your own basic wash with black acrylic paint and water. Mix them together with a ratio of 80% water and 20% black paint. If you mix your own wash, make sure to have enough to complete the current project. I've often found that my basic homemade washes are never made exactly the same way twice, so the results always vary. It's one of the reasons why I like store-bought washes. When we add our basic wash, we just soak our brush in the paint water mixture and dab it over the deep cracks of the stone formations. Because of the runny nature of the mixture, gravity will pull the paint down into the cracks, and after the water evaporates, the cracks will become much darker. It's because of that process that we don't want to paint over the entire surface, or will darken all of the stones. Next, we're going to use some Woodland Scenics turf to create a grassy effect on our hills. Since we are covering such large areas on our grassy hills, I don't want to use just a single color. I also want to make sure that I'm blending and mixing the turf as I go, in order to create yet another grassy texture on our hills. We're going to use tacky glue to cover our hills. I prefer this glue over PVA since it stays wet much longer and we don't have to rush. When we add the glue, try to keep as much as possible off the stone features. A little bit is okay, but we don't want to blend the rocks into the grassy turf that we'll be adding. The first batch of turf I'm adding is what I like to call the discard mix. This is a mixture of all the greenish turfs I've shaken off the project and put into a single container. Doing this reduces waste and creates a new color mixture for us to use. I suggest you use a small spoon and add the turf to the spaces between the small stones first. Add a few other spots of this mixture around the hill so that all the colors aren't clumped together. I'll switch to a different color and heavily sprinkle that turf on our hill, making sure to catch the edges and blend the transitions between the different colored turfs. While we're here, another option is to use white turf on your rocky hill in order to create winter terrain. We don't need a full tutorial to simply change the turf that we use in order to create snow-covered hills. You would go through all the same processes up to this point, but instead of using green-colored turfs, you'd just switch to a white one. I highly recommend that you use a store-bought turf or instant snow powder and not organic products like flour or baking soda, since they tend to turn yellow over time. 24 hours later, we can turn our grassy hills over and dump the excess turf onto our collection surface. We want to save the excess to use later as discard mix, and we want to identify all the areas on the hill we need to add another layer of turf. Next, we want to use a 50-50 blend of water and PVA glue to reinforce our build, and to add a bonding surface for a second layer of turf. The mixture will harden the turf that's already on the hill, so it will not chip away as hands and miniatures handle the terrain piece. We can add more turf to cover those areas where our first layer didn't get as much coverage as we wanted. We can use the same turf or blend as we did on the lower layer, but it's not absolutely necessary since the powders will blend together as the glue dries. I suggest the second layer of turf be very lightly added to avoid clumping, since it's the water from the PVA mixture that will harden the turf and change the appearance of the hill. Now we can use these colorful army painter tufts on our hill while the PVA glue is still wet. I found these at my local hobby store and they come in a variety of sizes and colors. Adding clusters of these graft tufts will help create the illusion of tall grass on our hill. However, I'm not trying to create the illusion of hills covered with tall grass or ripe wheat stalks. Another of my favorite products from Woodland Scenics are these bags of clump foliage. I suggest using at least 2 colors, but 3 or 4 would be great too. Despite what it looks like, this video is not sponsored by Woodland Scenics, nor am I affiliated with them in any way. Feel free to use any homemade or different brand of clump foliage you may have. Taking a look at our rocky hill terrain, I can see there are still a few places that our turf didn't entirely cover. These spots would be ideal to place our clump foliage so we don't really need any more turf. You can place the clump foliage in monotone clusters, or you can mix and match the foliage in the same pile. I suggest you don't pile the clump foliage too high since it flakes over time, and players tend to pick at the foliage too. I also recommend that if you're using a hot glue gun for this step, that you use a craft stick to press the clump foliage into the glue to avoid burning yourself. Here we can see that some of the white base is still visible around the outside edge of the hill. As a final step, we're going to use some burnt umber acrylic paint to cover those few exposed areas so they look like rich brown soil. Now our grassy and rocky hills are completed and ready for the table. Some folks might want to add a matte varnish as a final step, but with all the PVA glue added to our hill, I'm not going to bother with a varnish layer. My favorite part of this build was working on the tree bark rocks. The one thing that I would change on this build is to base coat the entire hill with a dark brown so all the exposed areas under the turf and foliage aren't so obvious. I'm glad I have this terrain ready for my players for our next game session. I'm also glad that I can use this in other adventures in the future. I am constantly in need of all manner of outdoor terrain, and part of the functionality of these hills is that by simply turning them to different angles, they look like different hills. If you'd like to support us here at the GameSmith, there are a number of ways you can do that. If you haven't already subscribed, now is a great time. Hit the thumbs up button and give us a like. Ask a question or leave a comment below. Check out our website at TheGameSmith.org. Read our free monthly blog and listen to our podcast. Finally, you can join Patreon, which gives you access to content like our podcasts and exclusive videos. Your support in any form is much appreciated. Until next time, I'll see you at the table.